Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm just looking at the number of participants rising up. So I guess there are already some colleagues with us listening to today's webinar for your lunchtime, your breakfast or evening discussion. We are welcoming you on behalf of Access Now, PRIO, and the Center for Humanitarian Action to today's webinar. We'll be talking about digital transformation in the humanitarian sector, taking stock and looking at and discussing about skills and capacities and standards. So we would like to take stock of what is currently happening, what is the state of the digital transformation in the sector, and we'll be talking about different aspects of digital transformation, looking at skills and digital capacities and digital standards. I have here with me two other colleagues you might be familiar with, and we will give you a short introduction in a second. But before really jumping into the topic, my name is Andrea. I'm representing here at the moment the Center for Humanitarian Action, and I would like to introduce you to some housekeeping rules to guide this webinar. So for you to know, the webinar will be recorded, and we will publish it on our website, on the CHAR website, and the YouTube channel after this webinar today, very shortly, briefly afterwards. Then we have a Q&A button and the chat function in case you want to raise any questions later on during the discussion. You can also raise anonymous questions. Please send me a private message to my user message function. Then we have, in case you have any technical issues, please feel free to reach out to the team and we will try to assist you to have a smooth listening to the webinar and a smooth discussion. Last but not least, the languages we will be speaking in English. So in case you need to have any live transcription, there's a function in the bottom low, clicking on the See Live Transcription, and you can read the live transcription. We will try to speak slowly, follow the live transcription to be as accurate as possible. And then, of course, we will have an introduction of the speakers and the discussants today, but we would also like you all to introduce yourself in the chat. I mean, I guess we are now very familiar. Webinars have become so common in our daily work, but it would be great to know who's listening in, dialing in from where and from which organization. And as I already mentioned, my name is Andrea Duechting. I'm working for the Center for Humanitarian Action, mainly focusing on aspects looking at the data and digitalization in the humanitarian sector. And we have been mainly working on aspects around digital participation and how to engage people via technology and what is the current state about it, but also looking at digital capacities. And with that, I would like to hand over to Giulio to introduce himself, and then Kristin. We have a different perspective and portfolios today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Over to you, Giulio.
Thank you, Andrea, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Giulio Coppi, as you can see, and I'm the Senior Humanitarian Officer at Access Now. Access Now is an organization that expands and protects digital rights worldwide for everyone, including communities affected by conflict. And we have a special attention to human rights defenders, NGOs, humanitarian actors, and when it comes to their digital challenges and the challenges posed by digital transformation and technology. Kristin.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today and let PRIO be a co-host of this event. So I'm Kristin Bergtora Sandvik. I work at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and I also work as a professor at the Faculty of Law, where I teach robot regulation and the ethics parts of legal tech and legal sociology. So a lot of my work focuses on humanitarian accountability. I've been working on refugee resettlement and gender-based violence, and also on the digital transformation of aid. So currently I'm trying to write a new book on the regulation of the humanitarian space, and I'm just learning a lot about procurement. Thank you.
Exactly, that's the three of us for today, but we would like to discuss with all of you. So we will, first of all, we will have kind of inputs, because all the three of us from different perspectives, legal, technical, operational, we have recently published different papers and books. So we will share our insights and learnings, what we have come across. during our analysis, but then we will open up the discussion. So please feel free to already prompt any comments or questions in the chat or the Q&A function, because we are talking about future-proofing. And of course, future-proofing, it's the three of us, but there are more colleagues online, and we would like to hear about your experience, your thinking, and what you believe is necessary in order to be ready for 21st century technical digital era, and what is needed for the humanitarian sector. And with that, I hand over to Giulio to guide us or kick us off to get into the discussion. Over to you, Giulio.
Thank you, Andrea. Before we jump into the digital skills reflection, I want to point out that, as you can see in the chat, our documents and papers and work and research has been linked there. So if you want to navigate and look for questions you might want to ask related to what we published, you can find it there. As for me, I published with Access Now a little while ago now a report on corporate technology, private technology, and humanitarian action. The lens is a little bit unusual. So it's the relationship between corporate technology, private actors, private partners, and humanitarian response. And it's not just big tech, but it's also data collection companies or B Corps or socially minded organizations that do develop technology. And we found, through this report, we found something that was just confirming our suspicion, which is skewed power dynamics and some tangled relationship between some companies and some armed actors, and their blurred lines in terms of data management when it comes to data collected in humanitarian context. So I'll let you discover that through the report. If you're interested in those topics, we go from the data collection process through the transfer of those data, through the connectivity lines and the access to the internet, direct to the matching against databases or through biometrics or digital ID, and finally on cloud processing, AI, and advanced analytics. So this is if you want to take the deep dive. But in practice, what does that mean in terms of the impact on the organization, on the humanitarian organization itself? And what does that mean in terms of the role of the humanitarian profession, the humanitarian actor as a professional? We're going to discuss today a few things that are not explicitly mentioned in the report, because as I said, this is not the lens that we decided to approach. And I think it's key that we twist the same reflection, the same findings, the same arguments, and we look at it from the perspective of the user being the field personnel, the headquarter professional that is involved in humanitarian response, that is involved in managing a humanitarian organization, that is involved in striking those partnerships eventually, that is involved in developing big partnerships agreements or data architecture, or even just, as we mentioned, the field team that goes to do an assessment or that comes back and needs to do the data analysis, or the country director at all stages. What does that mean to do digital transformation? What will that mean in 10 years? How can we prepare now to say that we are ready, or we will be ready 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And the way that we approached it through the report is to look at what does that mean to become a digital actor in a humanitarian context. And this raises all sorts of reflection in terms of what kind of skills are required to play that role in a responsible manner, in a responsible way. Our findings show that there are three main challenges in incorporating digital skills in future-proofing humanitarian action. The first one is a gap in accountability. Most of the humanitarian staff, unfortunately, do not truly understand technology. And it's not because people are stupid, It's not because people cannot understand it. It's just because that's not how humanitarians were used to look at technology. They were not used to look at technology as something they need to understand. They were used to look at technology as something they need to use. And these leads to a gap in accountability when it comes to ask people, why did you do this? Why did you choose this tool? Why did you use this system in this way? And the problem is that we talk a lot about accountability in the humanitarian sector, but you cannot be truly held accountable for something that you don't truly understand. So we're putting a lot of blame on humanitarian stuff and humanitarian personnel that is called to respond to extremely dire situations in a rush, very often with limited resources, without understanding or without being explained exactly what are the implications of the tools that they use or what are the consequences of using those tools. So this is the first big challenge in moving from a fake accountability, which is basically just an accountability, the lens of let's not be held responsible for what we have done, to true accountability, which means let's be responsible actors in the way we deliberately use technology in the humanitarian response. And this goes through making sure the staff at all levels know what they're doing. They understand the consequences and the impact. And this is a major problem across the sector. And it's not just for humanitarian actors, but also from tech actors. If you ask your tech counterpart, how are you using your tools? They don't know. They have no idea about how their tools are being used in humanitarian response. They have no idea about the consequences. So it goes two ways. The second one is the operationalization of digital transformation. So this lack in knowledge and this lack in skills on the humanitarian staff side makes it so that you have a man in the middle when it comes to striking a partnership with a big tech actor and implementing a digital transformation process and then implementing it in a crisis response together with the communities. The gap is that the middle layer is missing. There is a translation problem that infringes also on consent. We talk a lot about consent, but what does it mean to ask for consent to communities when you can't explain what you're doing? What does it mean to apply a strategy when you don't fully own the digital systems that you're handling and you don't fully control the data processes that are behind because possibly they are controlled by the company or the tech company itself? So what does it mean to have this kind of man-in-the-middle situation where you have a big gap and the communication gets broken and the operationalization of this digital transformation process changes? So this is another example. For example, can be the shadow IT system. So you have an official IT, and then when it reaches field teams, it then becomes something else. It can become like something set up by the team itself. It can become something that is whipped up in a whim, that is stricken in a bilateral partnership because you have a big donor jumping in. So these are the kind of situation that creates an operationalization challenge when it comes to digital transformation and the skills that come with it. Because the skills that people have in the field will drive those choices. People will make the choices that are more familiar to them. That will make what makes them feel comfortable, not what HQ or what their global tech partner will be telling them to do. And the third one is a power dynamic. It creates this digital transformation process is resulting in de facto monopoly or semi-monopoly by a few big tech actors that are basically the only one that can check all the boxes in terms of GDPR, in terms of getting access to big humanitarian actors and knocking on the right doors and striking the right partnerships and suffer the losses that come from making an investment in humanitarian response. That creates a power dynamic that is skewed, that basically translates into the possibility of either donors coming to local offices or to small NGOs and imposing their conditions in terms of, for example, you give me your data because transparency or because accountability or because, and the local team does not necessarily have either the skills or even the knowledge that they have to push back. And it's the same for tech partners. There you have tech partners that knock on the door, that proposes a tool, and you do have a skewed power dynamic that jumps in and that can modify the relationship between the user and the provider of technology, with the communities taken in the mix without their consent or without their opinion being asked. And it's the same when we choose a data collection tool. Very often it doesn't really factors in what communities might prefer in terms of what kind of data and how that data is going to be collected and what kind of format will be more familiar to them. This is all brushed aside, and it becomes a two-way conversation between what the tech company can offer and what the humanitarian actor can digest. Again, it goes back into a bigger picture of what are we considering are the good standards of using technologies. What are the good ways? What are the acceptable ways of deploying technologies? And I think Kristin is better qualified to tackle the standards discussion.
Hi, thanks. So, I mean, I think with standards, I think it's useful to give sort of a snapshot of where I think we're at. So, you know, this is a field that historically is really very much bound to international humanitarian law and also to human rights law in some corners of the humanitarian space. At the same time, it remains this kind of curiously underregulated field. Or the last, I'd say, maybe since the mid-90s, I think the Rwanda genocide marks a sharp sort of turning point. We've seen proliferation of standards in the humanitarian space. So the Sphere handbooks, protection guidelines, handbooks, for minimum standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of this has been evolving for a long time, and then the technology moment comes along about 2010 with the Haiti earthquake. And then there's a great deal of activity in trying to kind of merge humanitarian ethics and thinking about digital ethics. And I think what we've seen is we're in this phase where I should have put law at the bottom, actually, because we're at this phase where we're kind of slowly, I think, moving from what we as lawyers call soft law or even soft law to something harder. At the same time, the humanitarian space remains sort of a space with little oversight and few sanctions, and I'll get back to this. So we have respected and well-known and sort of, you know, best practice handbooks such as the ICRC Data Protection Handbook, which has been very important in the field and very important as sort of benchmark for what other actors should aim to try to do and articulate. And then, you know, hopefully soon, the Protection Handbook with digital components. Then there is something else which sort of comes in from the sideline to the humanitarian sector, and that would be regional standards. So you have the EU, for example, having lots of instruments, including, for example, the DigCom framework, which is kind of principles or ideas for digital competence, such as information and data literacy, communication, collaboration, digital content creation, and safety and problem solving. So this is very concrete, and it's not, you know, it's general, but it's also impinging on the humanitarian field. And then we have cross-sectoral standards. And as you see here, I mean, it's not new stuff, right? Because this has been under works for years. And I think a lot of the audience has been involved in this work. But just two examples. So the 2024, just this year, updated core humanitarian standards, which, you know, focuses on data use, data management, data protection, and the use of data for learning and better accountability. And then Interagency Standing Committee from last year. And now I'm really speaking too fast for the transcript, I'm realizing. Apologies. Data responsibility in all forms and shapes. And I particularly appreciate this document because it goes very much into detail and tries to be very specific about what it articulates from sort of the system level and down to the organizational level. However, the problem that you end up with at the end of the day is that there is no real punishment for violating these standards or for adopting them, smiling and walking away. So you might have disgruntled staff, you might have some sort of expose in the new Humanitarian, you might have donors that are slightly upset with you. Obviously, if your cybersecurity standards are poor, you will be attacked more than you would otherwise be. But you know, there's a problem of hard consequences. And this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine related to this idea that it's an underregulated field. It's also one that doesn't specifically, you know, like lawyers very much and is very skeptical to law and legal regulation, partly given the ethos of the humanitarian field, you know, saving lives and almost, you know, you have to choose between feeding recipients and feeding lawyers. And it's not at all the Wild West field it might have been 50 years ago. But this sort of professionalizing hasn't really gotten to the place of kind of compliance and due diligence yet, is my perspective. So you have certain laws that have been quite successful in this field. GDPR, I mean, it's a European Union regulation, but it's become sort of, in my view, a global best practice standard. And you know, I've heard numerous humanitarians complaints about what does it actually mean to be compliant here? How do I do it? Can someone just be practical and tell me? At the same time, it's really pointed attention to some key values, rights, and obligations. It's a bottle half full type of regulation for humanitarians, and then you know, it's good for recipients, it's good for communities, it's good for operations, and it's a fundamental right. As of last week and this week, the EU AI Act, which bans certain types of technology, regulates high-risk technology, and leaves other types of technology not unregulated because they will be regulated by other laws, but leaves them. It is set to sort of have global implications. The EU, the convention, the European Framework Convention of Human Rights and Rule of Law, Democracy and AI. Actually, it was also born last week. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that will kind of shape our future conversations on right-based approaches. So just a couple of dilemmas here, and I'm mindful of the time. So my kind of description of the scenario, and I'm very glad we're doing this little talk today, because you know, very often now, you know, we spend our time talking about the AI monster, but I think, you know, the everyday digital transformation of your work is you know, it's nuts and bolts. It's not glamorous. It's sort of getting to the office, switching on the computer, and trying to sort of to manage your operations. So I think there are certain, I really like kind of the detail we're able to go into here. With respect to sort of my normative corner, is there a proliferation of ethics that's, you know, is there too much ethics now? Some would say that, you know, this field still has so many ethical problems that we should continue to put energy into developing digital ethics for the humanitarian space, particularly now AI. Others say that, you know, this is just, we need to move along. We've done ethics washing for ourselves, but also for big tech companies for about a decade, and it needs to finish. With the standards, and as they are proliferating, you know, what are they actually for? I mean, they give you guys rights to stuff you have to do, make plans, undertake assessments, establish data sharing agreements, etc., etc. And then, you know, we can say that this is a bottle, again, is half empty. This is what Giulio probably would say is a compliance and liability lens, just to protect yourself. But more optimistically, as he also said, you know, the bottle is half full. This was the other way around. It's a bottle is half full. Yes, no, maybe I should not use this analogy if I can't keep it right. It's a tool for accountability. It's a good thing. We should have standards for improving participation and for kind of protecting or supporting the rights of communities. So, you know, you can look at standards in different ways. And then, you know, to the comment on power, yes, enormous gaps despite these standards. The fact that it's a pretty crowded space is possibly becoming a problem. I mean, you guys spend a lot of time, particularly the smaller actors, navigating crisscrossing standards and expectations from donors, from your bigger collaborators, etc., etc. And then finally, this endemic problem of oversight and sanctions. I sometimes think that I would wish a good lawsuit on the humanitarian sector, something big and spectacular that really kind of clearly highlighted risk for everyone not involved, and make the organizations invest properly, both in digital security, but also in sort of oversight mechanisms within the organizations to make sure that they were doing things right. On the other hand, not many people, except for me, want this spectacular lawsuit. So we'll see where this is going. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kristin. I guess for having this particular spectacular lawsuit, you would need to have certain kind of skills, but also capacities in order to know about the standards and the understanding the technology, as Giulio put it, in order to use it wisely and use it in a responsible and ethical manner, no matter what the question is, where does the ethical washing or ethics washing come in here? Because when you look at capacities, of course, it's also capabilities, it's resources, it's so many different layers. And I already saw a question in the chat about how to ensure inclusion and not excluding people having access to digital resources and digital tools. And maybe you're wondering about my shady background at the moment. I'm myself suffering from a power cut, unexpected power cut this morning. So I had to improvise and sitting in our garage feeling a bit like the tech innovators in the past, whatever years. But I mean, we have advanced so much. And as colleagues already mentioned, in order to keep with the pace of what's currently happening, we need to invest in certain capacities at different levels. And the capacities, of course, differ depending on the stakeholder and the actor and the levels you're working at. I mean, data protection and the general data protection rules at the EU level, GDPR, might be a good regular legal framework, but when you don't know how to operationalize it, up to the field level and to the people, it will be very difficult. So looking at a principled approach, using from an operational programmatic lens, the doing no harm approach, which many of us are familiar with from a protection accountability perspective, and applying it to a digital data context. What does that actually mean? I mean, we have data protection as a legal framework, but then if we look at it from a humanitarian principles perspective, from a doing no harm perspective, where are the people in there? I mean, what are the rights of the people to actually know what's happening to their data? I mean, we use informed consent, as already mentioned by Giulio, but do people actually understand what informed consent is all about and how to use informed consent? So in theory, they have a legal right to access their data, but do we actually practice this access to data, or can people practice it and ask what's happening about their data? I mean, many of us might know the examples from Ukraine where people suddenly asked what's happening with their data, and organizations were not ready to respond because they didn't have proper data flows in place, which were transparent and accountable, so they couldn't respond in theory and in practice. So if you have examples like this from an operational background, it would be super interesting to also learn from your realities and share them, please, in the chat or in the Q&A section. And we have the practical, the programmatic lens, then we have, of course, the data systems itself, the technical perspective. Yes, you can have safe, secure, transparent data systems. You should have them in place, and actually, because otherwise you cannot be accountable and cannot be made accountable. Because we talk about people having the right to taking organizations to account, but how can they do that if we don't have data flows, transparent data governance system in place in order to track whom are we sharing the data with? Who has access to the data? What is the segregation of duties? Do we have actually the data which we collect and process? Is it actually secure and safe to avoid cyber attacks and any other data incidents? So what does this mean on an operational level for a smaller organization when they are processing data on someone else's behalf? Maybe the organization asking a local organization to collect data might have a responsibility to also invest in their safe and secure systems. Or maybe at the decision-making level, at donor levels or HQ levels, do we actually invest enough resources to build those transparent, safe data systems for others? I mean, how is the money being allocated when we talk about innovation, when we talk about digital transformation? Do we think about how the data is being used in 5 years' time when the data is still there, but we don't use it? I mean, we are not getting rid of the data by tomorrow. The data will be there and will be potentially at risk being hacked or whatever. And then, of course, digital capacities are always linked to the big word which we are talking about nowadays about digital literacy, data literacy. But have we really unpacked what this is about? I mean, there are so many layers to digital literacy. Again, what are the capacities behind it? Understanding the technology, understanding the data which we are gathering. We are now talking about AI, but do we really know which data is actually feeding the systems? Is it representative? What type of data are we using? So we have to have a better sense of the type of tools we are using, but also the level of data which we are collecting. Is it still up to date? Is it accurate? Or is it just like you go to a doctor's appointment and you're giving your blood and it's just a moment, a specific moment where you're collecting a certain data which might not be representative in 2 years' time? So using the tools which we are introducing, but also understanding how the data is being used and analyzed later on. And then, of course, we already mentioned about the need to build capacities in order to better include different and diverse population groups and the people themselves, local actors, decision makers, donors, and so on and so forth. A tool might be useful in a specific context, but might not be the same kind of data points, the same type of segregations, might not be as applicable in another context. So maybe it's important for program colleagues to first understand the context again, how to involve people in order to design it inclusively, the different tools, and how to use the data responsibly. I mean, I remember when I read Kristin's book, I really liked the example of local innovation labs, which are, first of all, not really existing widely, and it takes time. We don't have the funds for it. So that's the reason why we don't involve people, because you have to translate our concepts about innovation and technology design to a different context where people might be not as familiar. So yes, we don't have time, but maybe there are different ways of involving people. So we have to start becoming a bit more creative and stepping out of our comfort zone to translate complicated digital context into different contexts, and would be super interesting to learn other views about it from other colleagues and also from your experience. Maybe you have good practices, how you were able to better include different and diverse groups. And then, of course, myself also working a lot on aspects like data sharing and interoperability. In the humanitarian sector, we are not working in isolation. We have a lot of discussion talking about nowadays, particularly in the cash sector, supporting social protection schemes, how to work with governments and how to work with other sectors. I think there's a lot to learn from, for instance, the health sector, how they are dealing with data and how they are applying data rights and how they are applying data regulations. So maybe looking out of an isolated humanitarian sector, yes, we have our own principles, we have our standards, but the legal frameworks, which were introduced by Kristin early on, are not only applying to the humanitarian sector. So why not looking into other sectors to understand how they are struggling with similar challenges, but how they are also applying them or operationalizing them, is something to think of and broaden our capacities and capabilities, understanding of who is doing what and how can we actually maybe step out of our traditional way of working and see how other sectors have actually not necessarily solved, but may be managed or to overcome certain kind of challenges. So for me, we have to think of capacities in a different way, not the, when we look at vacancies nowadays, we still have this typical type of profiles we are looking for, technical capacities and food security and health and nutrition or whatsoever. But where's the digital component? And we have to look beyond just one specific sector, but understanding how data is talking to different sectors and can be used or integrated between the different systems and not just think in isolation. That's what I would summarize when it comes to capacities. It's looking beyond and not just one specific, let's say, digital technology and data set, but understanding how to use it for different contexts and for different kind of settings and situations. With that, back to you, Giulio.
Thank you, Andrea. And I love that you already tackle part, at least part of the first question that we have in the list. I do think that there is a little bit to, there is kind of a common line that we agreed on in terms of the perspective, how to bring home the concept of future proofing. What are we talking about? So on my side, and I'll just recap in one sentence, the future proofing for me on the skills side is moving from using the technology to understanding technology. So this is to me the paradigm shift that we need to have to tackle all or big chunk of those issues that are listed in the report that we published. Most of them rely on the fact that we cannot explain technology ourselves. We don't know what happens. We don't even know what happens to an email that we send out. We don't know what kind of data actors are nibbling at the content of the data and metadata. We don't really know what happens on the data broker side. We don't even know who these people are. What do they do? How do they make money? Do anyone in this call know how data brokers make their money? How does that data business model even work? So the future proofing means getting familiar with the risks, the threats, and the models that we are now part of. If we don't do that, then we'll never be ready. No matter how much digital literacy we throw at the problem, we'll not really understand what we're dealing with. So this is a little bit my recap from my own perspective in terms of future proofing. Kristin, what's your future proofing solution?
Well, clearly, the regulation, I'm going to go a bit broader than you, right? So, I mean, to be fit for purpose in this department. So, procurement, understanding, what you buy and what you buy into, and then obviously still need to regulate use, but also, as you say, regulate requirements for how we understand this. What are we expected to understand about impact? And then I think for me, that sort of leads to two questions. I mean, I know this is about future proofing, but when Andrea was talking about all this data laying around, I mean, how much are we responsible for the past? I mean, do we need humanitarian data archaeologists, for example? I mean, we all know, I mean, everyone in the audience has a computer back home that you can no longer log into because you sort of poured water on it, you forgot the password, but there's an Excel sheet that shouldn't sit in your computer. And the other side is you talked about shadow IT systems. So understanding, what's happening in your organization. And this is maybe even more a question to people I see in the audience, Constanza and Addis, Fred, Diana, but this ChatGPT, for example, GPT, the simultaneous uptake. I mean, everyone uses some sort of generative AI. Is this kind of becoming a parallel IT system that wasn't planned for, isn't really controlled by the director or the person you report to, but it's proliferating, across the humanitarian sector? And what do we do with this? And I'll just end with an example. I presented a paper on cybersecurity for the Organization of Cooperation Security in Europe. It wasn't human rights. The panel was in human rights. My final intervention was in humanitarian risk. So my Preo comms person tweeted this and made a news item very quickly. After 2 hours, this event had been all about humanitarianism and was available in Serb and Spanish, in Portuguese, Russian, and English. So there's something about, future-proofing how we control our control of truth at scale, I think, which relates to technology, but also to regulation.
And also to one of the questions that we have in the pipeline, I see, but we'll get to that soon. Andrea, what's your recipe for future-proofing capacities?
Well, for those who know me, I would always wonder how people are going to be involved in the whole discussion, because coming from a programmatic background, I've learned from other lawyers that GDPR is a great framework, but it's a legal concept. And we have so many programmatic concepts. We have accountability to affect the population. We have protection. We have doing no harm. We have all these, programmatic concepts, frameworks. Why don't we apply them to a digital context? So we want to build agency. How do we find ways from a normative to a practical way of giving people the chance of owning their data, being a data subject, and building their agency to understand that they have a right to understand what's happening to their data. But at the same time, we have to build the capacities in various organizations for people to be ready to respond to those questions. And this means we need to have the skill set, we need to have the capacities, the understanding, but then technically speaking, also the governance systems in the organizations to have transparent mechanisms to be able to respond to those questions. They might be still in theory, even for ourselves. I'm not sure. I don't know what's happening with the data on Zoom now, for instance, and I have a right to talk to Zoom and then get an understanding of how they are going to use my data. But I at least know that I have the right to do so, and I have the system behind me to claim that law and to go and have the chance to do so. Why don't we allow people in other countries and those we are serving to actually do the same? So for me, it's a normative question in the sense of what does people-centered, people-oriented, people-driven, human-centric design, how does this translate to a digital context? And for me, it's a decision-making aspect which needs to be driven by all the stakeholders in the system, from donor level up to the frontline workers on the ground. And because you take a decision on which project to fund, you take a decision which donor call you are going to submit a proposal to, up to the ground, to the frontline workers, to have the capacity to explain people that they have the right. So we have to trickle it down. Like data protection for me is usually the easiest to think about, how to operationalize it. Yes, it's a due diligence and compliance factor, but that's how we handle it at the moment. We don't translate it to the ground. We don't translate it to realities in the different countries. And then we are compliant on paper, but not having the systems and mechanisms in place to give people a chance to really respond to it. So for me, it's the people aspect to better understand how we actually include, involve them, engage them in the whole discussion.
Which also links to jumping into the Q&A now, and thanks Andrea for wrapping up the suggestions part. But jumping into the Q&A, you already addressed a little bit of the issue of digital exclusion that was raised by Fred. I'll quickly maybe add a very simple, not an answer, but a perspective to this, which is we clearly do not involve communities in digital discussions. And the very simplest way to start doing that will be to expand connectivity to local communities where we work, to bring people in terms of advocating, investing, not just in expanding networks, because that has been done. UNHCR and others have been able to strike agreements with ETC, have been able to strike agreements with mobile operators to expand connectivity, to involve local communities. The donors sometimes they come from the back and they undermine this by adding, oh yeah, but you cannot access some website, or but you should only use it for educational purposes. You know, this kind of things that are absolutely unacceptable in this age. Like, people need to have an unhindered access to the internet and the communication mechanism. I think we established that. Now, the problem is that until people don't have that access, you can't really talk about digital literacy, because literacy without practice, it's meaningless. So a simple example will be, if you look at most of the areas where the ETC, the emergency telecommunication cluster, have been activated, there is a little known pillar, I think it's the number 4, that says connectivity for communities. How many times that has been activated? I don't think it has ever been activated. It has been suppressed and reinstated, but I don't think it's very used. This is up to the donors to fund this service pillar, number 4, service to communities. What are we talking about if we don't fund that kind of access and that kind of capacity? So this is also future proofing. And then protecting the networks. If we allow networks to be bombed first thing in the morning when there is a conflict, then what are we even talking about? And this is also why as Access Now we advocate against shutdowns, against interferences on the internet and the connectivity. And then I'll maybe chain a couple of questions because we don't have a lot of time left. And then Kristin, I got a couple lined up for you because you just came back from discussions on AI. We decided we don't want to discuss about AI too much because it's everywhere. It's a little bit annoying right now, but I think most of these discussions can also apply to big data, advanced analytics, anything that is not necessarily AI. To address the question by Pierrick, I think there is before we start even answering that question, I think we need to look inward. And I will invite everyone in this call to go back to your NGO website or your company website or your donor website, whatever, and look at the policies that you have published there. How many of those tackle the digital risk? How many of those policies tackle the redress mechanisms for digital harm? So before we even talk about accountability, we should talk about what is the visible engagement. Because I agree with Kristin, I'm the first one to say liability lenses, it's an easy way out. That was me, the glass half empty. But it is still better than nothing, meaning at least you're stating what you're engaging on, what your stakes are, what is your promise to the communities. What if you have a massive leak of data tomorrow and people get hurt? What are you going to do about this? Do your organization has a public policy about it? I'll tell you, no, you don't, because I've done research on all the NGOs and all the websites, and you don't have a public policy about what you will be doing, what you engage on doing if things go bad. So this will be the first step. You go back home, you discuss internally, you raise it to management and say, we maybe should do something before we start using generative AI. Okay, Kristin, now to you on the other questions. Some of them are about misinformation, disinformation, AI, generative AI. Please.
Thank you. I just had a pleasure last week of being at Wilton Park, where I met, it was a big roundtable of stakeholders discussing humanitarian risks and opportunities for the sector. So I think maybe I can't help myself, starting with Pierrick. I'm sorry, I know this wasn't a brief. I was trying to play around with principles like do not undermine digital resilience. And I have to say, do no digital harm is appealing for now. But I appreciate the thought and framing. On anonymous, with respect to sort of, the law, I don't think it's that humanitarians invest too much in trying to control their operations through law. I mean, I'm fairly convinced that most of you work for organizations without legal risk policies. And if I'm wrong, I would love to hear from you. And I think we have to remember that the idea is that, we will end our interventions, pack up, go home. And hopefully those communities will start building societies with rule of law. The rule of law is a good thing. And finally, Joe, with the data, I mean, I think partly it's also trying to understand, when is data hallucinating? What does data poisoning actually mean for us as a sector? I mean, it's different from that attack. What does that slow poisoning mean and how can we counter it? And also something that I've been wondering about is this proliferation of safety talk in conjunction with AI. I mean, what does that mean for us? Surely, I mean, is safety going to be, the new protection of civilians, for example? So, next year, safety will basically cover everything on Earth, including all over the humanitarian principles. So I'm a little concerned about what I'm hearing in language, but I would also welcome robust discussions of what things mean for us.
Thank you. And to discuss more about the data that is poisoned and the data bias and everything, this is a reasoning which is true, but it's not future-proofed. Let's future-proof that reasoning. Microsoft just launched a new system that I don't know how they came up with it, but anyway, that screenshots your laptop or computer 24/7 and then runs locally AI system to answer to your questions whenever you do a search. So you will never lose your files again. Now, guess what runs on local computers of humanitarians? Will you want to have that screenshotted all the time, every time, when you then look it up? Especially because the computer might be then passed on to someone else. So these are the future-proofing discussion we need to have in terms of these companies are not thinking about the potential uses in fringe cases. They design based on persona, and their persona is here, and the spectrum of human experience is there. So basically everything that falls a little bit on the fringes is not considered in their kind of strategic design thinking and the mainstream models. So it's also up to us as humanitarians to knock on the door and say, have you thought about it? Like, this is a very bad idea. So as we advocate also in the report, humanitarians should be more vocal and less complacent in the way they deal with technologies. When you see something, say something that would say in New York City, when you see something that is wrong, we need to be actively fighting against it, and we need to be actively pushing back and highlighting use cases that we're not comfortable with. When it comes to misinformation, disinformation, the challenge is even higher because it touches very closely and it kind of gets in a very thin line with the freedom of expression. So we need to be very careful. And sometimes humanitarians have this kind of drive of saying, but people are spreading lies about us. We need to stop that. No, we need to deal with that, and we need to find ways to coexist with a hostile behavior as we do in real life, as we do in the meat space as a whole. We need to do it in the digital space as well. There are ways around it. First of all, let's not do digital PR for the sake of it because it comes back to haunt us 20 days later. That would be a first nice step to start engaging on digital platform as we do in the real life with caution, preparing with skills and capacities and standards on how we deal with digital technologies. That will be a first big step. And finally, the final question, you want to take that one because that one is a very good one from Deke Hosman about, communities and the fact that there are data collections issue, no shared data set. On data sharing, there will be like a whole hour and a half of discussion to be done in terms of the ups and downs of data sharing. But Kristin, Andrea, who wants to go for this one? Andrea.
One of my most favorite questions. Now, for me, it's a question for the diverse universe of humanitarian stakeholders, because it's a matter of us figuring out how to work together and collaborate. And it's not, for me, it's not a data or digital issue, because we run so many mechanisms, systems in parallel for people it's very difficult to navigate. For me, the easiest example here are feedback mechanisms. Every organization nowadays has its own feedback mechanism or complaint or community mechanism, however you name it or label it. But then from a person's perspective, knowing that there are different organizations working in my location, I don't want to run to each and every organization. Ideally, I would just like to have 4 options or 5 options of reaching out to them, no matter whether that's digital, face-to-face, hotline, or whatsoever. I would like to have a choice how to reach out to them, to decide if my pledge is anonymous or not. And then it's upon them to figure out how to refer to the organization I want to reach out to. Why is it me, who is already in a difficult situation, has to figure out whom to run after in order to get a specific question being solved? So I fully understand when people are tired and fatigued about being told or being questions about or answering questions, no matter whether it's an assessment or a third-party monitoring tool or whatsoever. I think there are no discussions in the sector at the moment to figure out how we overcome these kind of different interests, or maybe to have an independent party steering this all. So we need to figure out how, as a community with different interests, with different mandates, with different regulations, how to address people's interests in a simple, clear, and timely manner without putting an additional burden on them to be able to understand how the system or the community is dealing with their data. Punto.
I think the data minimization is kind of the mantra that we keep repeating and we keep not following, not implementing, the kind of principle that the least data you have or you collect, then you can ask questions, but the least data you collect, the fewer risks you run of breaching those data, of doing something wrong with that information. So this is already something that should be implemented. And again, if you go back to your organization, the organization you work for, or the other organizations that are working for you or with you in the field, have a look if their policies mention data minimization as one of the inspiring principles. Probably they don't. So one of the things that we hope to see, for example, in the professional standards for protection work that are soon to be announced, we hope that there will be at least a mention of data minimization in terms of putting these out there, Kristin, looking at you, as a standard, as an official standard for the sector in terms of keep it low, keep it simple, keep it short, like don't overreach. So that is potentially something that we are looking forward. At least that will be a first step. And then coexisting real life, Ananta, your first question is also about standards. So Kristin, you want to address that one?
Coexisting with real life. Yes, I think that's something we all struggle with at times. I think, I was thinking as you spoke about, the potential for regulating data minimization. So unfortunately, as you said, it's a known kind of weakness in the sector to want to do much more because you can. And I think as we regulate AI, for example, the fact that you'll have AI creep on your missions now and on the things you do, because simply you can collect and collate so much more. I think we highly welcome that there should be some more structured thinking on minimization. But also because the world is changing, the right to be forgotten, for example, and how, and this, this is also complicated territory and maybe academic, but, archives, for example, the UNHCR and the ICRC archives, what do they archive? What kind of information? If you are a refugee, what happens to your file once you're no longer a refugee? So the vulnerability assessment framework in Jordan, the data, was transported into the refugee assistant information framework, which was keeps being transferred into other larger platforms, even though you've left for resettlement, a decade ago. So there's something maybe old-fashioned about how humanitarians cling to recipient data. Not only abandon recipient data, but cling to them, and which I think we need to have sort of better conversation about. On the other hand, deleting all of this data would also make it more difficult to maintain narratives about what humanitarian action has been and is. So it's a complicated discussion. Just finishing up on the EU AI regulation and humanitarian work outside the EU, I think the same as GDPR for a while. It remains to be seen how effective this regulation is. I think, de facto, a very cold war between China and the US and changes to humanitarian exemptions and requirements on digital procurement, for example, will possibly shape humanitarian practice as much as legal regulation, but remains to be seen. But there are a lot of good questions here that would have deserved, 10 minutes each.
And yeah, we're hitting on the top of the hour, but I think maybe, Andrea, we can go a little bit over time. Mark, yes or no? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, yes. If people want to stay until we reach the last question. Okay, so I'll take the next one from Anonymous because it's straight down my alley. So if you're interested in that kind of discussion, I suggest you go to the report unless you haven't done so already, that we published, that is linked in the chat, because that's exactly one of the points that we raised. The fact that there is an extractive behavior by big tech companies that is also drives some of the engagement on big data, AI, machine learning, advanced analytics, all this kind of stuff. The communities that are disconnected, that are affected by conflict, that are outside of the commercial advertisement data loop, they own very valuable data, because exactly the kind of data model that, as we mentioned already, tech companies are focused on is here. So it's always the same data from always the same people that is gathered over and over again through your laptop, your smartphones, your interviews, your survey, your online activity. What they are missing is everything on the fringes, everything from communities that are disconnected, that are not as active online, that are maybe on different servers, that are not as connected online to the same system that these companies are used to tap into. So these are valuable data points and data sets and metadata that have, in the age of AI and big data, they have an enormous financial value. So humanitarians, in a way, they have not such a big incentive in using the latest emerging technology from big tech, because anyway, we can't afford it. We very often just do a pilot and then it dies out. But these big tech companies, they have a huge interest in exploiting those data sets, in collecting your community's data through the chatbot that they are offering on your communication platform, be that Skype, WhatsApp, or whatever. They will tell you the data is anonymized and we don't share it, but the metadata will be extracted. The metadata will be used. The information from the training of the algorithm will be used. And this will be used to fuel a multi-billion machine that needs data to run, that runs on new, fresh data every day. So yeah, definitely answering to your question, there is a way to push back, which is stop doing stupid pilot without clarifying what the conditions are. That will be a first step. The second one will be very clear and open in terms of what kind of agreements we have with tech companies. One of the results from the report is that nobody is publishing the agreement they have with the tech companies. Everything is done in the shadow. Everything is done through non-disclosure agreements. This is unacceptable for humanitarian organizations to be stuff and don't publish it. Why public authorities publish their tenders and their public procurement documents and humanitarians don't? Why don't we do it? We should do it twofold, tenfold, actually. We should be very proactive in publishing who are we working with and what are the conditions. And then the concept of, this is also linked to the question from Theodoros. I don't think there is an easy way out, meaning humanitarians are part of a digital ecosystem that is extractive by nature. Like, you can't fight that unless you design or you decide that you're going to develop your own internet that runs on your own laws and standards and frameworks and language. These are the rules of the game. So the options about is, again, as we started at the beginning of this webinar, saying we need to be conscious about what does it mean to share data on the internet today, and not just being on the app and sharing your tweet or your Instagram post or TikTok video, but what does it mean to literally put the data from affected communities online, whatever that is, because right now, even putting on your laptop, it creates a copy on the cloud. So where is that cloud? On which server? What kind of algorithms are running in that server? Is that data used for military targeting? Is the same company providing military services? Is that company providing military services to some parties of the conflict in the same context? How do I know? This is the kind of questions that need to be answered if we want to use a human rights inspired approach to humanitarian crisis. Kristin, Andrea, anything you want to add?
I think we need to wrap up, but I just wanted to answer Thea's question in the end about bias and racialized bias. So, and this is something to think about, right? So I think for a lot of us, we have painfully, been glued to our screens and felt it in our hearts over the last couple of months and years in Ukraine, but then in Gaza and to some degree in the Sudan. But I think the over-attention to the Gaza conflict at the expense, and I'm going to be a little bit brutal here, at the expense of attention to other conflicts is also digitally mediated, right? But it is something that we all, to a certain extent, have elected to embark on. So in a way, it's we don't need the systems to manipulate us if we are willingly playing along, right? So I mean, not paying enough attention to the Sudan, to CAR, to other forgotten conflicts. I mean, this is a long history of forgotten conflicts in humanitarian space, but I think what's currently going on should really give a lot of us kind of pause and how we can sort of benefit from all the information that we can now have, but also make sure that we distribute attention and finances and funding to where there is a humanitarian need, and make sure that that humanitarian need is not measured and manipulated in a way that really skews the balance of assistance the way we're currently seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Andrea, you're doing the housekeeping. So any closing remarks from you or from Cha?
Okay, yeah, that's for sure. I mean, closing remarks always. No, I personally like the way, I mean, first of all, for all who are still around and listening to us, thanks for being there and participating and having joined with having joined our discussion for the last hour. I personally really appreciated it because it felt more like a chat with two familiar colleagues with a broader audience, and I really appreciated your comments and your questions and triggering further thinking. I feel like these kind of spaces where really thinking about what is needed in order to take a step forward is really needed, because we have the tendency of complaining what is not working, of raising all the challenges and the risks and the threats, but there's also an opportunity out there that there's a new way of working. So the opportunity is there to think new and afresh on how to approach all these challenges. And I feel like there needs to be these kind of spaces where we can future-proof, where we can think of what is actually needed in order to be future-proof. And yeah, let's have more like these kind of discussions where we bring in different perspectives, from a legal perspective, from a technical, a programmatic one, because for me, to overcome these kind of challenges is only about sharing knowledge, sharing experience, and talking across functions and across levels. So with that, I would like to invite everyone discussing with their peers they might not talk to on a daily level. As a program officer, go to your tech IT advisor, go to your legal colleague, and ask how to solve common issues in an integrated and collaborative manner in order to support the people in different ways, not only with food assistance or aid assistance or whatever, but also in a digital responsive way. And with that, wishing you all a good day, afternoon, evening, and morning, and hope to see you soon again. And thanks again to Kristin and Giulio for joining me to this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.